And there we go. Okay, so as you just heard, I started the recording, so at least you're aware of that. And thank you for joining us today for this virtual innovation workshop, focusing on the underlying principle of drug development for those companies who are a bit more earlier stage and need to factor that in their development plans. So very, very brief introduction from me. For those who don't know me, I'm Aline, Head of Innovation Support at One Nucleus, and I'll organize this session on about a monthly basis and really focusing on the key topics that we feel companies, especially of early stage / growing life science companies, need to consider to become more operational, more active deal makers, and think about their next step strategic development. So that particular topic of today is quite close to my heart because that's something I hear a lot from the development side. Okay, you need to, understand your market, understand your regulatory pathway. You need to understand your clinical development, etc. But then when I talk back to the more early stage companies, it's yes, true, but it's not exactly at the top of my priority list at the moment. Whereas it should be, because that's really important to be factorized when putting business plan together, talking to investor, having at least an idea about return on investment, market size, etc. So that's the context. I hope you'll enjoy the presentation. So we have Paul Branthwaite with us today from Transcript, who is really knowledgeable and expert on the space. So we will just provide some insights, share the slides. But we have a small group, and obviously you may come from different background or perspective. So if you have any question, even very basic on just explaining some of the principles, just raise your hand or drop that in the chat box, and Paul will pick up on that. We'll see how it goes. So Paul, if I can ask you to put your slides on.
Yeah.
And just introduce yourself quickly.
Can you see anything yet?
Nope.
Well, I'm asking to share, and it says you're sharing at the moment.
So that may be my fault then. Try again.
Yeah. Okay, I think we are getting there. Okay, can you see the slide?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so as Aline referenced, we have a mixed group in the audience, and because I'm not quite sure of in terms of how specifically knowledgeable you are about the drug development process, I've agreed that I will not use acronyms. I will actually say the full definition. But as an FYI, Transcript, which is obviously the organization I work with, are actually in the process of producing a dictionary of terms with one of our people, an expert in the space, talking to it on our website. That's not there yet, but it's coming because we think this is an unmet need overall. So the agenda will run as this. I'll do a quick brief on the who I am, what Transcript does, and the context of this discussion. And then I'm going to talk about the two major elements that I want to cover today. There are many, and an hour is certainly not enough to go through all of that. So in terms of me, I'm a pharmacologist. Some of you have met me previously. I've been in the business since 1979, which dates me somewhat. And I work as a senior partner within Transcript, which is a drug development house. And one of our sweet spot areas is that experimental development and transition into the human model, which is why I'm speaking to you today. In terms of the context, they are literally multiple considerations within the programs in terms of things that you need to prepare for, etc. We're going to cover two in more detail. Now it says regulatory pathway to first clinical trials, but this is a combination of regulatory and actual development pathway because the two are indivisible. And then obviously we're going to look a bit at what investors are looking for in terms of your preparing your prospectus for them to look at. So to put it in context, I wanted to remind everybody what drug development looks like in toto, and what elements sit within that area, which happen either in parallel or sequentially, but also within each of the categories, there are multiple strands which also are either in parallel or sequential. So timescales are hugely variable. They depend on the drug, the disease, the particular circumstance, and I'll give you an example of COVID. We had direct experience of COVID changes in the regulatory and sites, ethics committees, etc. We were able to complete an entire drug development program from phase 1 to phase 3, and we're currently writing the registration package from the time COVID started. So from, I think, January, February of 2020, we completed the entire development program in a year and a half. That, to put it mildly, is unusual, particularly as COVID also affected other programs adversely, in the sense that phase 1 units closed down for 3 months in many cases. Patients weren't available because the travel restrictions, etc., etc. So circumstances can hit you in either direction depending on the reality on the ground. Suffice to say, any Gantt chart associated with drug development is complex, to say the least. Now, for the obligatory joke slide, how many of you know that John Steinbeck, the writer, was a toxicologist? Well, it's absolutely clear from one of his textbooks that he was. And on that note, and without any smiles around, I shall move on to something more appropriate. So, first principles. At the risk of teaching grandmothers about eggs, and I know Suzanne's on the call and knows much about this already, but here goes. It is blindingly obvious that you need to know what your therapeutic is ultimately aimed at. However, the caveat is that the therapeutic target for your proof of concept in a preclinical setting, and certainly in a early development in the clinic setting, and possibly even the registration, may not be your ultimate target disease. And the reason for that is that it is sometimes easier to do the development in one therapeutic area rather than where the money actually lies, simply because of the speed that you can get on. And I'll give you an example in autoimmune disease, which I always use, because if you do your autoimmune disease early development in psoriasis, which is a very sensitive condition, you can see actual clinical results in 3 days. As again, looking at an autoimmune disease, which takes months or even years of progression, you can see that it's easier to get a registration or at least a proof of concept in man in one model than it would be to go for your ultimate target disease where the money is. So just bear that in mind. Is this medical need either ultimate target or the one that you're looking initially at? Is it a recognized indication in the FDA?
Oh, sorry, can I? No, just one thing. I think, and I think that's your microphone. I was waiting. Sometimes it goes down and up again. So
okay.
Would there be a reason for that, like you putting your hand on it? Or?
I doubt it, but
okay.
I will speak coherently, I hope.
Okay. No, so, that's fine, but yeah. Just,
all right. So I'll stop mumbling, Aline. Is that what you're trying to tell me?
No, that's not that. I think it was a microphone thing, but yeah, carry on close to it and I'm sure we'll be fine.
Okay. So the FDA and EMA publish lists of what they consider to be actual registrations on their websites, and you need to ensure that yours sits within that when you're putting an application in to either of them. And I'll talk about the various applications in a second. However, there is a caveat to that, and things are changing a bit in that common pathway approaches. So, if you have a disease cascade which has a complement component, for instance, it may affect rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, I've already mentioned, respiratory, allergic conditions, etc. That may actually be changing the way the regulators are thinking. And indeed, there is in what we call IMI, so Innovative Medicines Initiative program going through the European side of things, where they are trying to redefine diseases by underlying mechanisms. And that may be something to consider for the future. But right now, just use the indications that are on their lists. And the other thing is that in orphan conditions, you may actually have population constraints in terms of the numbers of your people in your clinical studies. So if you look at Fabry's and Gaucher's disease, which are both lipid metabolism disorders, they were lumped together when the early drugs were being developed for those conditions, simply because there was a common pathway. So it's not set in stone, but you have to understand why you're going in a particular direction or not. So in terms of orphan indications, I've already alluded to population sizes, but an orphan indication is good in a sense because the speed to registration is likely to be much faster. And for small, medium enterprises, that speed can be a key to survival. And the other flip side is for the investors is that the pricing as an orphan, as against a large disease population, it can be much higher per patient. And there are very few marketing costs associated with it, so investors like orphans as a rule. However, there are rules applying, particularly in Europe. You can't go into an orphan indication at a high price and keep that high price if you go into bigger disease populations which use a common pathway. So you need to be clear about that. And then finally, can it be ultimately considered for breakthrough therapy designation? Now, this is a technical term, and I'm going to quote this. This is a drug that treats a serious or life-threatening condition, and preliminary clinical evidence indicates that the drug may demonstrate substantial improvement on a clinically significant endpoint over available therapies. And the key three words are over available therapies. So it has to be materially better than what's available for patients, and that it is a serious or life-threatening condition. Now, these do get fast-tracked. You actually get a little certificate from the FDA, which gives you the ability to go through the regulatory process quickly. But it usually, and I say usually, only applies to the drug that is first in class. There is a last bit, which is an imponderable in a sense. Sometimes you come across something which is not classified in their list as a current indication. And there is still a regulatory path forward in there, particularly if there is precedence, but it will require a meeting, so either pre-IND or a scientific advice meeting with EMA to determine if that is allowable. An allowable disease, which then gets put on their list. So it's not a showstopper. Other considerations, and this is clearly critically important. How will you differentiate from the current standard of care? And importantly, what else is in the pipeline, either now or in parallel with your own product or coming up fast behind you, that might impact on the both access to patients, but also access to the market. You need to make sure that there is some element which is demonstrably better than current practice, or at the very least augments current practice. So is it safer in combination or alone? Is the patient easier to manage? Are there better outcomes? Or does it have some other advantages that the healthcare professionals and increasingly importantly, the reimbursement authorities, so that's things like NICE in the UK, it could be the insurance companies in the States, that they will adopt it. A caveat, and this is a something that I came across a few years ago myself. Don't assume that is what is good for the patient is good for the healthcare professional. So, for instance, in the US, doctors get reimbursed for giving injections. They don't get reimbursed for prescribing tablets. So guess which they prefer to use in a clinical context. And that has to be factored in. Sometimes you need more than one form to work in different parts of the world. Secondly, mechanism of action. That needs to be defined. In European terms, they won't allow you to have a registration unless the mechanism of action is actually defined, understood, and accepted. Less problematic for the FDA. They just need to know if it's working and it's safe. But it's really good to have that, at least a putative one, before you start talking to the regulators at all. But sometimes you don't have that possibility. And the other element, which goes to the putative mechanism of action, is that sometimes that can actually help you foresee what toxicities may be coming down the pipeline. And this is principally why the European agencies want to know that, because they can, with their experience, sort of predict what might be a problem. And then the other thing is the risks and costs and whether can you actually physically do it. One example, and I might allude to this later, is that is it doable in a clinical context? Depends on who you're competing with, not only for the market, but literally for the number of patients who are available. There are certain cancers at the moment where nearly every virgin patient, if you understand the term, is being sucked up into a clinical trial. So anybody coming into that clinical trial environment is pretty much stuck because all the patients are being whisked away by somebody who may actually be paying more than you are to the individual sites. So, does an ITLAM development plan exist? And are the risks of development, as I've sort of alluded to, manageable? And there's certain things that you need to think about, and there are quite a few, and some of them are more important than the others. But essentially, you need to look at the what can be identified for further consideration, and those that you should know already. So your development pathway choice needs to be pretty clear, and that and the regulatory pathway, and we're going to talk about this in a second, are intertwined. Your safety planning, both in terms of what you're doing, what animals you choose. This is, to an extent, if you're dealing with a therapeutic which has shall we say, something which is like it already gone through, then that helps in terms of choosing your animal model. It might mean that you can actually use fewer animals or fewer species in the preclinical context, but also you need to plan how you're going to manage adverse events, particularly in diseases which have high mortality or high morbidity anyway. That is an art form, frankly, and you will need to get advice on that. You also need to look at each inflection point. Now, for me, inflection points come into various categories. There's the financial inflection points, and then there are the developmental inflection points. They're usually aligned, but they're sometimes not. But the timescale to each inflection point needs to be pretty much formulated. And that's why I said about making choices that decrease the timescale is as important as actually getting the right plan in there in the first place. And ultimately, registration is what you're looking for. Even if you're not going to do it yourself, the partner or the investors that you're going to move the portfolio into wants to know when they're going to get a registration and then get their money back and then some. We also need to look at the likely cost of the full development, and the rule of thumb is you don't know what your likely costs will be, and your estimates will be severely less than what it really costs, just so you know. I've already talked about competitive activity, and that's competition, as I say, both in terms of market, but also in terms of competing for your clinical trial populations. You will need a pricing analysis. That's actually quite relatively easy to get nowadays. There's lots of data and tools to extract that data, which give you a pricing analysis of current and what the market will bear. Expected geographical spread is interesting because it will impact pricing. So I'll give you an example, a historical one, with HIV. HIV was initially a Western world disease, and the therapeutics were certainly Western world, and the prices accordingly were high. When it became a much more global thing, the pricing had to change, and it did. The industry, individual companies cut the costs, but then we got the Bill Gates involved and all the rest of it, and the WHO, and suddenly, HIV became a much more affordable treatment for HIV became much more affordable globally because people actually realized that had to happen. And to an extent, this is happening with COVID. We've looked at the price of the vaccine programs. AstraZeneca, bless their cotton socks, essentially produced their vaccines at cost and gave the intellectual property away. Effectively, they're only now starting to say, right, we're going to make some money from it, but that most of it from their perspective has already gone and by. So there will always be circumstances that throw things up, and you can't predict what they may be, and I won't even try to speculate on that. So moving on, the regulation.
Sorry, can I interrupt with a question on development plan?
Yeah.
So when would you recommend to start writing one? And if you say as early as possible, then that means it goes with different iteration as the discovery data progress.
I'm not quite sure what you're trying to get.
So I'm trying to understand, because we said this development plan, that's a really good thing to have in your head as early as possible. But how early? That was my first question.
Well, this goes to the in terms of working with your investor teams. That is critically important for them to understand what the likely development plan will look like. I mean, it doesn't have to be very detailed, but it has to be thought through. And the elements that I've alluded to have to be factored in, because you can't just pluck a number out of the air. It has to be logical, a logical progression, and why you're making those choices. And indeed, that then feeds directly into any interaction you have with the regulators, because they're going to ask the same questions, which we'll get to. But from my perspective, as soon as you have a therapeutic target in mind, you have to start thinking about what will the preclinical development, absolutely, you've got that nailed, but the clinical development plan needs to also be outlined, because ultimately you may have the greatest molecule since sliced bread, but if you don't know how to get it to a registration, then you may as well not start. So for us, and this is an iterative process. When we talk about, and we write maybe 1.5 regulatory dossiers a year, oddly enough, usually for big pharma. We also really go back to first principles. So those first principles have to be understood, and will come out, and we have clinical pharmacologists and toxicologists dealing with the dossier as much as data and all the rest of that stuff. And to an extent, that can be planned for and thought through, and at least an outline produced at a relatively early stage before you even get anywhere near going into first in human. And if you don't do that, then you are going to waste time. You're going to have to repeat stuff, and that is ultimately wasteful, both in terms of term and cash. time, and cash. Does that answer your question, or do you need
Yeah,
more?
no, I think that answers it. And also I think that serves as the base for this iteration you will have to produce, because obviously things evolve, as you say, regulatory environment, pricing and reimbursement, competitive landscape, etc. So
yeah, you might find a new indication, and
yeah.
suddenly you go off at a tangent. And we see that so many times. And I'll refer to one I worked with in the early days in cyclosporin A in transplantation. We thought it was an antibiotic. No, it wasn't an antibiotic, but it certainly saved a lot of people with who needed a transplant. So it's these things are not set in stone, but you at least need a set of guiding principles and some thought as to where it might go. Otherwise, nobody's going to be interested. Okay.
Thanks.
In terms of the regulatory pathway in the run-up to first in human, this is not a single linear process, or indeed the pathways can be extremely variable. But the preparation for discussions are obviously vital, and good preparation is really vital. There are a number of critical pathway elements that you do need to include, and this happens for both an IND and the definitions are on the little blue box on the left-hand side. So either an investigational new drug application, which is obviously the FDA, and a clinical trial application, which is European Union and UK. They are slightly different, and they're not hugely different, and a lot of the things which are key are the same. So effectively you can take a particular pathway, but you need a good regulatory savvy person either in your back pocket, or you go out and find them to help you put that critical pathway together, because they know not just what you need to put in place, but they also know how the regulators are thinking in terms of how you, and Aline and I were talking about nuances as a French word earlier, and the whole process is nuanced. So don't think that you read a rule book and it'll be clear. It won't, particularly in Europe. So you may or may not want to have a pre-IND, a scientific advice meeting. Effectively, they're synonymous with a regulator. You have the choice of which regulator to go to, and that is your choice. You don't have, the EMA doesn't say, right, go to regulator X and we'll take their scientific advice. You choose it, and that can be based on how quick they are, how responsive they are they going to be useful to you, do they have a lot of experience in dealing with this, and you know, for me, the regulator of choice was always the MPA in Sweden, because they are immensely helpful. They actually rewrote a protocol for me without even me asking them to consider what was going to be working well in Scandinavia, which is unusual. Don't expect that, but they are particularly helpful. The Dutch are very quick. The Danes are getting much better. Obviously, the British are no longer in the EMA system, so use that as you will. But going to the MHRA for scientific advice is no bad thing, because even if it's not part of the EMA structure, the EMA will take that on board. The process is, you know, in terms of what do you need in advance? There are risks in going to the for scientific advice, because in truth, you may ask them a question and the answer you get back is not what you were hoping for. They may ask you to go and do more work in a particular area which you hadn't factored in, and that has the risk of being a delay and also costly, but that's the risk. On the other hand, if they agree with your proposition and what you're trying to do, then it makes your life, when you do actually apply for an IND or a CTA, that much more certain. And the attitudes of the group that you're going to talk to, you need to know what their what they're likely to have a bee in their bonnet about, and that again would presuppose that you have somebody who's used to working with the regulatory authorities and can tell you what they're likely to want to know about, and that gives you the prep. So what do you need to put in place? So I'm just using the FDA as an example here, but there are some commonalities with what EMA would look for, or sorry, the regulatory that you're going to for PIND meeting would then report into the EMA if required. So what you need for your briefing book. Your briefing book essentially is the Bible of all the information that you have to date, the propositions you have, etc., etc. And these are obligatory to be sent before the meeting on a specific timeline. And I'm not sure that is hugely variable across the EMA, but you do need to make sure that you meet those timelines. Target product profile. What is that? So you've got a drug with a particular chemical and a target choice set within the chemistry of that particular molecule or biological, what have you. And the profile is the thing that you ultimately want to get registered, at least at the moment, because that will allow you to use that information to sell it. And unfortunately, that is the ultimate goal, is you need to have something which you can actually take to the market. So it will look at the medical need, it will look at how the indication, the label, how it's to be used, etc., the caveats, the black box elements of thinking your patients who shouldn't receive it, da-di-da-di-da. It should look at and this is particularly true in Europe, the benefit risk profile. This is a technical term which literally balances the expected benefit from the risk that this is poisonous to some patients. And then obviously the points of differentiate refer to what is the standard of care currently. And the TPP effectively helps you write the briefing book, because everything that pertains to the TPP should be set out in the briefing book so that the regulatory authorities can understand what you've got, where you're going, and what you expect to do in the plan. So the other thing is that your questions to them should be very clear, and it can cover anything. It could be the tox data that you have. It could be, you've got a problem with the CMC. This is how you make the drug. So it's about the manufacturing process, the control of that, and the chemistry of it. So that aspect needs to be either clear in your own mind, or if you have a question about what you may or may not do, then you ask it. The DMPK, we're talking about the kinetics of the drug within the model. So how does it get distributed? How is it excreted? What are the kinetic profiles of the efficacy parameters? All of that needs to be clear, or you have to ask a question about whether the data you have is acceptable or not. And then obviously the regulatory pathway or clinical questions that you may want to challenge. Each question must have a clear rationale, and it also needs to be consistent with where the company is positioning it. But, and this is clear for the FDA, you don't ask for advice directly. That's not the FDA's role as they see it. You put it in terms of, do you agree with this proposition? And the FDA says yes or no, and they'll give you the reasons why they don't, if they don't. But you can't say to them, we've got this, what do you think we should do? That's not going to be helpful. They will send you away. And then the other aspect of it is you should have some data, having reached out to people who are already treating this disease using the existing standard of care. That's usually done through clinician interviews, it states here, but that healthcare professional research is required to support the, the medical need proposition. And frankly, if you've got some of the great and the good asking, as part of that rationale, that helps, because the obviously if they have stature, so principal investigator or a big key opinion leader supporting your proposition, then that's going to be looked at better than if you haven't got that. So that is a requirement. Okay, so let's look at the IND, Investigational New Drug clinical trial application itself. Again, I'm sticking with the FDA, and this is the reference to the regulatory pathway if you want to look it up. The investigative brochure now kicks in. The investigative brochure, as it suggests, is a information piece for any of the investigators who are going to be involved in your clinical programs, and it should essentially have everything in it that is relevant to what is likely to happen with the patient in terms of efficacy, but also what is likely to happen with the patient in terms of side effect profile, what you're expected of them. This is the investigators, what they need to put in place, etc., etc. So that is literally the Bible for your clinical program. That goes into the IND application. Included in that is the summary of all of the preclinical information, particularly related to safety. Effectiveness, yes, but safety is the real sine qua non that needs to have been addressed, and that will feed into what dosage regimes you're going to be leading into, and I'll talk about that in a second. So it requires you to outline what you're going to do with actual humans. Now, this is not just patients, this is actually volunteers as well. So what populations are you going to look at? Healthy volunteers, yes, but you also may look at volunteers who've got pre-existing conditions like renal failure, if you think that a kidney tox is likely to be a problem with your drug. And then obviously you need to work out which patient populations you're going to look at, what populations are likely to respond well. And if you think about where Herceptin in breast cancer went, as a general term, it wasn't particularly effective in the overall population, but in a particular subset, it was wonderful. Although we're now getting brain metastases because it didn't pass the blood-brain barrier, and women who had positive results with Herceptin are now starting to die of brain mets, which is sad, but foreseeable. It looks at other things like the placebos, the dosing, starting dose for man, how many doses you're going to have. Normally we look at 3 at least, so we can get a dose response curve. Then have the sites got the ability to do the correct sampling to allow that modeling to take place. What's the washout between doses? Look at the single ascending and MAD considerations, which I won't go into in any great detail. I've also alluded to the fact that the CMC, which is now defined here, includes what drug substance and what drug product is. So the drug substance is the active form. The drug product is everything that goes into the thing that is going to be stuck in the arm or swallowed by the volunteer or patient. So there are some special, I'm going to go back just slightly. A whole host of other things need to be considered. It's about what techniques for measurement are going to be used. Are they well established? Will you need a considerable training? Do you need equipment, lab techs, all the rest of that stuff? And that needs to be thought through. Your application may also require you to produce your tox reports, any kinetic and dynamic analyses, the indication that you're going to use in man and I say in man, it's usually in man that goes in first, versus where your final indication may be, etc., etc. So it's complicated. There's lots to do, and you need to start thinking about it really towards the beginning of your development program. So I'm going to move tracks now. Are there any additional questions that have been raised since we started?
Hi, Paul.
Hi, Sapan. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
It's a long time since we saw each other in person, Sapan.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, so I have some questions about well, so the orphan drug designation, and you mentioned fast track, and it needs to be only the first in class gets the fast track designation.
Right. So, okay, no, there's a difference between orphan indication and a drug which is effectively how I described it, breakthrough.
Okay.
There's a difference. So breakthrough indications could be for big diseases in terms of populations, but it is going to make a material difference to millions. It could also be an orphan indication. It's an indication specifically aimed at something which is going to make a big difference very quickly.
Okay. So in that case, I mean, what I have not understood sometimes is what is the definition of first in class? Is it the one that addresses the specific target, or is it the one that addresses the indication? If you see what I mean, the difference.
Yeah, good question, because quite often it's the first chemical of its class, which has a different mode of action from anything that's gone before. And it go back to what I said about the mode of action being very important, because if you've got something which works in a different way from drugs that are pre-existing, then you've got a first in class.
Okay.
It may be that you've got something which is chemically very different. So, you know, gone from a small molecule to a biologic, which does something at the same target, but it can be differentiated because it does it slightly differently, and the, shall we say, the side effect profile, because it's so much more specific than things that have gone before. You could also define that or argue that that was a first in class.
Okay, thank you very much. And if I may, I have one more question, sorry.
Sure.
So that's in the TPP. You mentioned there are various things to include there, including the label indication. And within the label indication, you mentioned things like the exclusion criteria, basically, should be included. Well, how do you find these exclusion criteria before doing any clinical trials to understand what the toxicities are?
Right, this goes to a certain extent back to the mode of action, because if you have a particular mode of action and it isn't so specific that it only targets your disease cells, then you're likely to have a, shall we say, a side effect profile, because that target, whether it's a receptor or something like that, is present in other areas of the body. So, for instance, there are certain receptors which are found in the gut, but oddly enough are also found in the testis. So if you have something which works in gut motility, but you have the same receptor in the testis, then you may have testicular issues. So you have to either do tests to eliminate it, or you have to say, right, there may be a potential for testicular involvement, that sort of thing. Okay. So the how it actually works at the target receptor or molecule or whatever you're trying to eliminate or activate, that needs to be at least understood enough that the toxicologist can predict where it might be problematic. The other thing that toxicologists are really good at is looking at your molecule and predicting from the shape of the chemistry of the molecule, whether it is likely to be toxic or not.
Okay.
That only really applies to small molecules.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sapan. Anything else, Aline? Anybody else putting up their hands? Have they all disappeared?
I'm good. You got into
Okay.
the technicals.
All right. So in terms of the what the investors, this is going to be relatively simple and straightforward because it's not exactly rocket science. And this is just really to remind you what investors really need to know, and any prospectus that you're putting in front of an investor really needs to hit them between the eyes in the first 3 sentences. And first one is clearly, what is the size of the market? How big is it? What are the numbers in terms of patients? How is it distributed? All of these things which are factored into whether or not they're going to be interested in it, and the current value of sales, which I've already alluded to. So essentially what they're trying to work out is that if we put money into this, are we likely to get our money back? And are we likely to get our money back with a number of orders of magnitude return on that, which is where they start to salivate. It used to be not something that we needed to consider, but now we need to know is how are products like it being reimbursed in the US and the EU. So I think of areas like some wound care products, for instance, which are not reimbursable. So if you've got something which is prescribed by a doctor in a wound care setting, then reimbursement is pretty much guaranteed. If it's not, then it's a grey area. So if it's something that say a nurse would use or something like that, you may get some pushback in terms of whether it's reimbursable or not. It's not a good example, but it's sort of trying to be illustrative. And then there may be other hurdles, and I think the most egregious one of recent times is the argument that Vertex had with NICE in the UK, which took 3.5 years to resolve for a drug which was an absolute unmet need, in the sense that it was for a rare, severe form of cystic fibrosis. But the unit price was such that NICE said that it wasn't cost effective. Eventually, they came to a compromise. The price came down. NICE was pressured by the patients' advocacy groups. Eventually, they came to an agreement, but it took a very long time to get that. Now, for a big pharma who've got other markets, that's not necessarily an issue. The UK is a small market in global terms, but it's something that you may have to factor in. And my final active slide.
Sorry, can I just, quickly on the previous one. So yeah, as you said, that stating those, but do you have tips on how you can collect this information? You know, the usual source of information is going to the big databases, right. And then
to give you an example.
And I think if I can be a bit more specific, is the landscape is changing a lot, and with all the big therapeutics, new modalities, etc. It's less straightforward to get a proper market analysis because there's so many unknowns. So it's you have tips on how you get information, and maybe it's more about this risk mitigation thing. And again, if you have any advice on how you can do that.
I think it falls into two elements, Aline. One is, have you got something which is outstanding? And if you don't, where's the material advantage? So you take that as one element to it. The other one is getting the data on what the market will bear and what it is already bearing. And I do see the companies who they say, oh, rheumatoid arthritis, it's worth $60 billion US worldwide. That's the market we're going after, which is patent nonsense, because a lot of rheumatoid arthritis is handled by non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, which are ibuprofen, which you buy over the counter. So you have to find out the sector that you're actually really going after within that population pool. But there are ways and means of doing that. There's a number of data companies, and Global Data is the one that we use, where you can actually see, first of all, what's coming through in terms of competitive information, but also how much is being spent in which country for this indication by category of drug. So you can really get into the weeds with this if necessary. If you're an early development company, it may not be appropriate to do so, but you can certainly get a sense of whether or not your drug is going to be useful. And that's the key thing. If it's not useful, or it isn't differentiatable enough from what's currently out there, then it's not worth going into that indication. Or you've got some real advantage, which would make people want to pay more money to get that advantage, whether it's safety or whether it's, a cure. You look at psoriasis at the moment, which I have alluded to. We can effectively switch psoriasis off now with some of the monoclonals that have been developed in recent years. And in a sense, psoriasis has become a far less interesting area to do development of drugs in, because now we have drugs which can actually switch it off. So you have to see what material advantage would you bring with the new drug in psoriasis. And if you can't show that advantage, then go and look at some other indication. Okay. Thank you. All right, so my final one, commercial proposition. Here's another technical term for you. And I've defined this. Your net present value is a financial metric that seeks to capture the total value of a potential investment opportunity over its entire lifetime. I think that should be added. So what investors are looking for is, based on the target product profile that you're running with, how much is actually, what is the actual worth of this over a decade or 15 years? And you put that to the return on investment. Is that how much you're going to need to spend to get it to that NPV? And that's the balancing act. Because if it's too expensive to get it to the TPP, it doesn't matter what the NPV is. If it's either not a multiples of the investment cost, then nobody's going to invest in it. Very straightforward. And the last thing I'll go back to, costing the development plan and the timelines to deliver that is fundamental to your planning from the absolute outset, because without that estimation, the investors don't know how much they're going to have to fork out and what their likely return on that in a timeline. It may not be their timeline, it may be to the next inflection point, and the inflection point beyond that, where the drug is being passed from investor to partner to big pharma, et cetera, but you need to have that development plan in its totality at least outlined in terms of what it looks like and what it is likely to cost and how long it's going to take. Because without that, investors are really, they're just sticking their finger up in the air and wondering which way the wind's blowing. And on that note, I'm going to shut up and ask if there are any further questions.
One question, Paul.
Yeah.
A lot of our work is with investors, and often hear them laughing, saying, everybody's slide deck's got the multi-billion-dollar market value, as you kind of alluded to. Is there any advice for companies and actually getting a more realistic value that investor look at and say that's some due diligence.
Yeah. Have somebody who works in the investment community kick your tires. Yeah, I mean, in truth, if you go to an investor with something which is completely outrageous, as you say, it'll be filed under waste, because you really haven't given them a realistic NPV and what their realistic ROI is going to be at the various inflection points along the pipeline. I hate to say this, but there is no substitute for getting good people to talk things through with and kick the tires of the ideas and say, have you considered this? You may have underestimated the net value, frankly. I mean, we have come across companies who've got a drug which is, they've focused on a particular area because it's their area of interest. And we can see the dollar signs rolling out from a completely different direction, which they never even thought about. So, your advisors should be giving you some of these steers anyway. But I always say, and I'm not saying this because it's something we do, although we do, but getting a third party simply to kick the tires and ask about the what if scenarios and the considerations of this and that and the other, simply because you get blinkered, your advisors get blinkered, and your investors really, they're looking for a much more reasoned argument why they should part with their ill-gotten cash, funds.
No, it makes sense. I saw Kate Bingham speaking on Monday, and she just said in her 30 years, nothing has gone according to plan. And so that idea of having other people kick your tires and give you kind of alternate ABCD plans makes total sense. Thank you.
Well, it's not necessarily that you should give up on the game plan, but if it hasn't been stress tested, I talk about stress testing quite a lot in my career, then you may be either missing an opportunity, but there may be an elephant in the room that could actually make a big difference to what your calculations are saying. And to go back to what Aline asked about data, there is a lot of data available. Some of it is very discouraging, and I do like people who've got a vision, who stick with it through thick and thin, because they're the ones who are the deal. They're the ones who break things open. That, and I always go back to my Novartis days with a guy called Jean Borel, who, don't ask me why, he always used to take soil samples on his holidays. And he was hiking up the Hardangervidda fjord about 40 something years ago, took a soil sample, and cyclosporin came from that. Novartis tried to kill it at least 10 times, but he had enough political clout with Sandoz, as it was at the time, to say, no, I think we should take this just a little bit further. And then suddenly a random conversation in Cambridge with David White and Roy Kahn, and suddenly, boom, we went from a no-hope antibiotic to something that was used at least at its peak on a million patients per annum worldwide, and saved a lot of lives. I like people like that because they are stubborn and they just keep driving. But there is a reality check down the line, is that stubbornness is not enough. You have to have a cogent argument as to why somebody will going to put money into it. And for that, you need data, and you need people to cross-check your assumptions and give you that reality check and say, well, actually, it's actually only worth 10% of what you think it is, because this is the only population that's ever going to be used in. Live with it. But the investors will thank you for that, because it allows them to make a much more coherent decision.
Thanks.
Anything else? Sapan, you're looking very thoughtful. Or is it you're just staring at the brick wall behind you? You're on silent. You're on mute, Sapan.
No, I was just thinking about the TPP and NPV that you mentioned. I am assuming, at an early stage, it is based on a lot of assumption in terms of the proportion of market that it will address, and so on. And how do you factor in any other competitive product coming in?
Well, there's lots of elements of that. One is you need to know what your competition will be. Who else is looking in this particular disease area? Right at the beginning, I alluded to the fact that sometimes disease areas aren't even codified, and because it's an example which is dear to my heart. Transplantation didn't happen before cyclosporin A, so effectively the disease area came from the drug, not the other way around. That doesn't happen very frequently. Normally, a unmet clinical need is relatively well codified, whether it's an orphan disease or, as is increasingly the case, where even big diseases are being subdivided into subsections. So eventually, we're all going to be a rare disease, even if we've just got a headache. The fact is, if you can actually address and say, right, we've got this disease, we have this therapeutic, it is materially better than anything else, then you have a TPP you can actually hang an argument on. If it's just a me too, I can't see an investor investing in it unless there's something else about it. You can produce it at 10% the price or something like that, but that's not very exciting.
Yeah, my concern is that is the material difference between what we are developing now and what is existing now is now, but what we are developing now is going to be available down the line 10 years later or whatever. Well, so how do you account for that?
Yeah, well, you can, in the sense that everybody who is doing any clinical workup has to publish what they're doing. So, the data is out there in terms of what your competition is doing. They have to define what the study is doing and what it's aimed at. That's law. You just go to clinicaltrials.gov, you can see it all, and you can search it. So you know exactly what's going to be available in 5 or 8 years' time from the first time it goes into man, depending on the indication. So you will have an idea of what is, shall we say, between you and you getting a registration, and what is likely to be the competition. And you have to quantify that and to see whether or not what you've got is likely to be material better than what they've got. Bear in mind that only 1 in 2 drugs that actually get to registration get a license. So, there's a lot of people stop doing development because they see 2 or 3 drugs ahead of them and all 3 of them fail, and they suddenly haven't been doing any work and the patent life's ticking and all the rest of that stuff. So it's not necessarily a reason for stopping just because you've got something that is ahead of you. One thing you can look at, can we accelerate what we're doing and get ahead of them? So we are first to the market in this indication with this drug type. And that is something that is also doable, if you box clever. But that data is available, Sapan. And then at an earlier stage, people who are, there's publication of data and there's publication of data. Some companies keep everything very close to them and they don't let anything out into the public domain. So you don't know, something can come out of left field. But by and large, if you're looking at things which are, spin-outs from universities, there's usually some information out there about who's looking at what and why, which you can make some assumptions on. And if they've spun out a company, for instance, but you don't know what they're doing, you look at what the original professor was researching, you get a pretty good idea about what may be coming down the pipe. But you have to you have to do your background check, or you get somebody else to do it for you to see out what the competitive space is likely to be in the 5 to 8 years between where you're at now and when you're likely to get a license.
Thank you.
It's not easy.
I'm just
I
conscious of time. So
Yes, we've
a
gone
few
over.
people saying
Sorry.
thank you, but probably leaving because like everyone else, they have plenty of
Yeah.
meetings piled up. So unless there is any other burning question, I will.
I'm happy for anybody to communicate with me if they want to follow up, Aline.
Yes, I was about to suggest that and to mention that UC Transcript is partner of this Virtual Innovation Center. So that's providing that type of sessions to share knowledge, expertise, but that's also, as you said, to have this one-to-one conversation with anyone who has one of this burning question that you don't want to ask in front of everyone, and just to take it further down with Paul and follow up on that. So I will leave you to
Lunch.
finish your day and lunch. Yes. Oh, yes, we have to eat. I forgot that. But thank you very much for joining. There is actually another VIC session next Monday on research collaboration agreement. So sort of a legal pharma perspective on that. What's negotiable, what's not. So it could be of interest for those involved in heavy research. And I will send you a recording of the session and Paul's contact details. So then if you want to follow up with him, just do it directly. Thanks very much.
And thanks for listening, guys. I hope it, I hope it's been useful. That's all I'll say.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Take care, guys, and good luck with everything. You'll need it.
Thanks. Bye.